Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where you will get to listen to some of the best short stories ever written. As a youth, Neil Gaiman fell in love with Avram's stories. Philip K. Dick adored him. Ursula Le Guin thought his tales wonderful, and Ray Bradbury compared him to Kipling. Each episode will include a special guest, an amazing short story, and a discussion of that story. Enjoy classic tales such as O'er All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, The Sources of the Nile, and many others.
How could you be? It sounds like a story to me, yeah. Sounds like a story to me.
We're live.
Okay.
Henry,
It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. It's been a while. How are you holding up?
I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah?
Here in New Jersey, I've got a lot of books to read, and then woods to walk in to keep the body sane and the organism happy.
I love the bookshelf in the background. It reminds me a lot of. Were you ever at my parents' house? I don't know if you ever.
I certainly was. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but I did spend time there. Yes, but right up there, I think the yellow books are Avram Davidson titles. So we are in the science fiction. I'll send you a picture, a snapshot of the shelf. But we are in the science fiction corner of my bookshelves.
I love it. Well, if you remember my parents' house, I mean, you could. Their entire house was completely full of books, and it got worse and worse.
So, walls and walls of them. It was great.
Or better and better, depending on how you look at it.
Yes.
Well, I mean, let's get started with a question for you, which is, I know you never met Avram, but how did you get involved in all of this? What?
Well, the first thing we have to remember is that this all started in the days before the internet. Information was a lot harder to come by back then. But I picked up in the local used bookstore a paperback entitled The Enquiries of Dr. Esther Hazy that probably would have been late April 1993. And I read it, and I knew right then that this was a writer I had like no other that I had encountered, and I wanted to learn more about it. The one thing I did remember as a reader of Weird Tales magazine, then edited by George Sithers, was that George Sithers had published with Owlswick a collection of Avram's short stories, the new edition of the Esther Hazy, and the Adventures in on History had just been published. I called up to order a copy, and George Sithers said, Avram Davidson died last week. And I felt profoundly affected by that as a reader already then. And so I began to try to find more books to read by Avram, more stories, and got connected with the people at Locust Magazine, and eventually through the SIFWA directory, perhaps got in touch with Michael Swanwick and Grania Davis, your mother.
Okay.
And the rest is history.
And
I started to find out more information about Avram Davidson. I wanted to read more stories.
Wow. Well, I have to tell you, a huge debt from you. So just so you know, without you, honestly, I couldn't be doing a lot of what I'm doing. Your website, for example, it has been the map for me to get my arms around everything. So I just want you to.
That's a great metaphor that you use, because Avram Davidson described British Hidalgo as a country you can put your arms around, and the whole point of the website, which evolved rather curiously, was to make this information available. I got in because of the connections with through Locus. I was able to write letters to Grania and to Michael Swanwick. I started learning more about Avram's work, and then I wrote a fairly industrious list of all the things that I could find, and had lots of notes, and published an article on it in the Bulletin of Bibliography. And then one day in the summer of 1995, I went to a friend at work and said, "Can you help me put all this information into a database?" And he said, "Let's make a website." I said, "What's that?" And so the Avram Davidson website was born in September 1995. It was at that point, I think I was coding in text and then handing him a floppy disk, and he would upload it. And it was a long time before I ever actually even saw the website, but it kept growing. And then a month later, the company I worked for got email, and so I started communicating. And the next year, I started the Nutmeg Point District Mail as a newsletter. And I still remember the first email from a famous person, even really famous person I got, Bruce Sterling, as a result of that. Of course, I printed it out, and I probably still have that up in the attic. But the reason I did this was because I wanted to learn more about the work of Avram Davidson. I figured others might. And the science fiction community is very welcoming, so that the whole time I was doing this, I was meeting people who have become friends, like Eileen Gunn, Michael Swanwick, and your mother, and beginning to just exchange ideas and express my admiration for Avram. And then in the early '97, I started making regular trips to the West Coast, and I think that might have been when I got to know your mother a little better. I would make a stop in the Bay Area and see her, and then pretty quickly in succession, and she got a number of books out to revive the legacy.
Amazing. So tell me a little bit about that. You know, the other 19th century, the Scarlet Fig.
I helped Grania behind the scenes with most of the anthologies. The Treasury she had done all the legwork, but there was a certain amount of editorial diligence that So we started working, talking about and making sure we had good texts of the stories, and I began corresponding with places like there was one part of the archive was at Fullerton, and another part is at Texas A&M. These had been deposited there in the 60s and 70s, and there were material that came out of there that she was then able to sell and place in fantasy and science fiction and so forth. Working with Grania was a lot of fun. It was sometimes a roller coaster because we often had different opinions about the way best to edit Avram Davidson and how to present him to the world. But we got a lot of great books out into the world. I think the one I'm most proud of having edited with her is the Lime Killer stories, and that really brought a whole new world into being in one place, because the stories were scattered over 15 years of anthologies and magazines, and when Lucius Shepard said Avram would have been proud, I felt we had gotten high praise.
It's amazing. No, like I said, I owe you a debt of gratitude, because without you, I don't think I'd be doing any of this.
Well, then I've helped, because for me it was a question of being mature enough and mature enough and ready to start reading Davidson. I don't think if I had read something of his in my teens, I might not have appreciated him the way I did when I came to him. And I don't know, how did you really start digging deep into Avram's work?
So that's an interesting question.
Because you grew up, you're his godson, right?
Right.
You're his godson.
Yeah. So I'll see if I can do this quickly and concisely. So when my mom passed away, I was left her estate, Avram's estate, with zero instructions. and a house that was completely full of stuff. There was an entire room dedicated to him, and that room was really crowded, and it was probably the least crowded of the entire house. So I had if I had just carefully gone through every single item, it would be about 10 years before I could probably get through her house. So I dutifully packed up everything of Avram, except for a few boxes, and I sent it to Texas A&M, to the archives there. And I had Avram was my godfather. I loved him. He bar mitzvahed me. He was just so nice and wonderful to me. But as an author, if you've listened, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to some of the other podcasts, but I had other authors that I liked. I had authors churning through our house. So he was just my godfather. He wasn't really an author to me. So fast forward to the beginning of COVID, and I received a call. Someone was interested in some Avram stuff. And I said, you know what? I don't know anything about this. So I should probably go up into the attic, grab the few boxes that I have, and see what's going on here. And actually, funny, similar. I have this Esther. You say Esterhazy, and I say Esterhazy. Do you know which it is?
No, I don't speak Hungarian or Volca, Floxish, or any of the languages of Scythia, Pannonia, and Transbalkania. So.
But I think honestly, it was this book that got me really to say, what am I doing? And it's not the book itself; it's what he wrote inside of it, which was to my godson Seth Davis, with very great appreciation from Pa. And I thought, I should probably start reading some of his stuff. Then more, dear Seth, as you appear in this very book on page 364, I thought it only right to send you a copy of it for your very own. You may let your mother and your father and your mother look at it now and then, but only if they are very good and speak very well of your loving Pa. And then I started finding letters of his to me, and it made me sad that nothing's happening. And I just thought, my mom dedicated so much of her time to bringing his work out there and keeping it relevant. And I thought, I need to do something. I just can't let it sit and die. And so then I started reading it, which I hadn't done before. And I've completely fallen in love with it. Yeah. I mean,
even nearly 30 years on in my adventure with this stuff, I have to say, all I have to do is pick up a book and start reading, and I realize, wow, I noticed there's things that I notice now that I didn't know. I didn't know when I began, and so it's a wonderful process, and I don't know, that's what keeps it new.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have to be careful, as I said on the last call with Eileen. I have a day job, so I have to be careful. But I'm reading some of his stories 3, 4 times, 5 times. I'm just loving it. Yeah. Well, question for you. You helped on some other things. What's still out there? If you had to pick another project or something, what do you still think there is to be done with his work?
Well, there's at least one more good collection of uncollected stories that would find things from all different periods of his career. Because as diligent as Grania was, there was the Treasury is a sort of greatest hits. One volume of mysteries didn't really cover all. The investigations didn't cover all of his. In fact, Grania and I had sold a collection of stories to a small press publisher right before the financial crisis, and they walked away from it because they had overcommitted themselves. But that would be good. There's also the Virgil Magus novels. There's a lot of short stories uncollected, so either an omnibus or a 4th volume of miscellaneous Virgil pieces and interesting fragments from the notebooks. That would be a good one. And then I still would like to make some kind of selection of Avram's letters, because he wrote really interesting letters to all sorts of people, from Peter Beagle, his lifelong friend, to Philip K. Dick, and many others in between. And they're always interesting letters.
Well, speaking of Philip K. Dick, and I don't want to take a lot of time on this, because Ethan and I had a conversation where we thought we could do an entire episode dedicated to Philip K. Dick.
Oh, absolutely! I'm sure you could. And
but given the story we're actually going to be listening to, A Brave Old World, which is an alternative history story, obviously.
Yeah.
I think of Man in the High Castle, which is one of Philip's most famous stories, especially now. Any thoughts on that relationship? Or
that is actually the novel which introduced Avram to Phil and Phil to Avram, because he reviewed it for Fantasy and Science Fiction in the summer before it won the Hugo Award. And there's a fairly cogent argument to be made that it was Avram's review which brought it to enough fans, the attention of enough fans, that people voted it for the Hugo. It's a fascinating review, and I guess that correspondence continued after that, and they because I think Phil Dick stayed with Avram when his house got burgled, and he had to call the police, and his safe got blown open or whatever, and in Berkeley, so he went and stayed with Avram. But there's a step between 1962 and 1973, and that I think involves Grania, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there are, without going into too much detail, I mean, the beautiful letters that I have between Avram and Phil, between my mom and Phil, between Phil and my mom. Some will never see the light of day, but they're beautiful letters, and there's stories to be told.
Yeah.
So,
well, we should definitely do a full on
Philip K. Dick special.
The most recent publication of the Nutmeg Point District Mail from 2018 is the pamphlet Chance Meeting, which reproduces Avram's review of The Man in the High Castle with a couple of other related pieces, and that was fun to turn that up. And that's something I had read all of his stuff in fantasy and science fiction, but 25 years ago it didn't stick. And then suddenly it was much more interesting. And then, of course, all the hoopla about the video adaptations of Phil Dick has only continued in those 25 years.
We could go on for hours. I want to get to A Brave Old World. Last question before we get there. I mean, out of curiosity, I always like to ask this: favorite Avram books?
Oh, that's a tough one, but
one or two.
Okay. It would definitely be El Vilvoy de las Islas from the other 19th century, the story of South America. That's great. And close on its heels would probably be Polly Charms, The Sleeping Woman, which is an amazing Esterhazy story. And he really, though they're so far apart, and yet they're the same author at work, and the play of language, and it's great stuff.
Well, one thing I'll mention in terms of doing more things, I mean, as you mentioned before, there's some stories where they're just sort of floating out there. I read The Certificate, which I don't know if you've read that. I love that story. Yeah. And I don't know, it's a little bit different than, I think it certainly could have been in the Treasury, and yet it's not. I mean, there are a ton of other stories that I've read that are amazing. So,
there's a good anthology or collection worth of material, and from very short pieces to longer pieces that have never been collected.
Well, let's get into O Brave Old World.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna hit play in just a second.
O brave old world. All morning long the bells had been ringing, those bells which had been for a while silenced so that the sound of them might instantly signal if enemy troops were to land. But by common consent and by clerical permission, they now sounded something else entirely. The reddish, gray-haired man looked up from the sheet of parchment, of which he must by now, it seemed, know every letter, so often had he scanned it, Immersed though he was in his text and his thoughts, still he lifted his head at length and spoke. "Sounds as though every church in the city is ringing its bells," he murmured. The friend and countryman who had so long and so often stood by his side, figuratively and literally, said, "Yes, and even in the suburbs. The liberties, as they call them here." The reddish-gray-haired man made a soft, musing noise, turned again to the document, then half raised his head once more. "One might call them Liberty Bells, then," he said. Another thought brought his head all the way up. "What was it?" he asked. "That text from Scripture, you recall, don't you, on the bell in Philadelphia?" His friend and countryman considered, nodded. "Proclaim liberty throughout the land." "Aye, liberty. The Jews had a word for it. And unto all the inhabitants thereof, aye." He nodded, sighed. "Philadelphia," he said. "Williamsburg. Richmond. The Chickahominy. The Rappahannock." At the door, a burly, tousle-headed fellow, cheeks stubby and shirt none too fresh, open at his shaggy breast, looked in, listened. His face showed a mixture of impatience and compassion. Often had he listened to these and other refugees recounting, as a litany, the names of their towns and provinces. One could not always tell them apart. Sometimes the names of the New World, perhaps brave, perhaps just bold, merely echoed the names of the Old. O servant exalted above the master. Sometimes they seemed a concatenation of barbarous sibilants and gutturals from the aboriginal tongues. Ah, well, to duty. "Are you quite ready for us, then?" he asked the two. They turned. "Ah, Charles, I should think—" "Ah, Charles, just one more moment. A last look. You understand." Of course. No wish to rush you." He coughed. He raised his eyebrows. The reddish-gray-haired man went back to his text. The friend moved quietly and gently and tactfully — he was not always quiet or gentle or tactful — eased the newcomer away. "He won't be much longer at it, I promise. I know." Yes. You've known him a long time." "Since his hair was quite red." Arm in arm they moved out into the corridor. There all was controlled turmoil. Country squires and yeoman farmers with mud on their boots spoke confidently to craftsmen smelling of machine oil in the forge. Bishops, white-sleeved, listened with modified majesty to inferior clergy, all in black save for the white bands at the neck. And a member of the old peerage, head covered with a wig of archaic cut, nodded to the comments of an old man wrapped in a ragged and still technically illegal tartan. It was at least as likely that this last anachronism had crossed, recently and hastily, from long exile in France, than that he had descended from Scotland. The Estates, as the Scottish Parliament was called since the revisions of the Act of Union, had done little more with the use of their regained powers than to pass innumerable acts of outlawry and attainder upon each other. But this, too, would soon enough pass away. Very, very soon, in fact. On seeing the two approach, one gentleman, evidently in a condition of total confusion, as well as in court dress, sword and all, buttonholed the burly fellow with an agitated air. "Where will it end, Charles?" he asked. "Where will it all end?" "All's well that ends well," was the half-muttered reply, then added, after a moment's recollection, "Doctor." As though needing no more than this acknowledgment of his profession, the doctor at once said, "As to where it all began, why, say I, it all began with the fatal tennis ball, or, if I may be permitted to say it," here he glanced around defiantly, "the insufficiently fatal tennis ball." "Water under the bridge," Charles muttered, tugged to watch out, glanced, then muttered again. "Water under the bridge. London Bridge." But the medical man's phrase was overheard, was appreciated, was at once repeated and passed from mouth to mouth. "The insufficiently fatal tennis ball." And the bells rang out, and the bells rang on. St. Paul's, St. Martin's, St. Clement's, Bow, St. Mary-le-Bonne. The insufficiently fatal tennis ball. The Stuarts, as even the handful of still unreconstructed Jacobites would needs admit, the Stuarts had their faults. But they had not hated their heirs. That is, the Jameses and the Charleses had not hated one another. And, to be sure now, Anne Anne had certainly shown no fondness for, first, Sophia, Dowager Electress of Hanover, and for Sophia's son, George, but they were only Anne's distant cousins and were far off in what someone later was to term a despicable electorate. Poor Anne, last of the Stuarts actually to occupy the throne, 13 pregnancies, and no heir to outlive her. She might have been, and was, excused for not wishing the sight or presence of her so distant kin. But it was left for the kin themselves to exemplify the phrase of Elizabeth, her sentiment that she could not bear to hear the mention of a successor. And yet, even so, Elizabeth, too, had had some reason. Had she not? "The Queen of Scots hath a bonny babe, and I am but a barren stock." Thus, Elizabeth. But what reason had the sovereigns of the House of Hanover for hating, and for so hating, their own heirs? Heirs who were of their own bodies lawfully begotten and lawfully present. Had not George I, at a court levee, publicly cursed his son, the future George II, forbidding him thenceforth to attend cabinet meetings from which, there no longer being any interpreter whom German George felt he could trust, the king thenceforth absented himself from? And a good thing, too, said many. Even this, however, had faded beside the subsequent hatred of George II for his own heir, Frederick, Prince of Wales. The English, not used to the sort of thing which was evidently traditional in Hanover, the English had murmured, poor Fred indeed. The king could not, after all, immure the Prince of Wales in a palace prison, however much he called him scoundrel, nor could he cut his son off from revenues which either had been voted as supply by Act of Parliament or accrued by ancient English law and custom via the duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster. However much he thought and called him fool, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was, however, subject to all the coldness, the scorn, hatred, spleen, and exclusion of which his father, George II, was capable. He was left to moulder in his own petty counter-court, attended only by those politicians who were not merely out of favor, but entertained no hopes of ever being again in favor while George lived. The prince was left to admire the poems of Pope, and he was left to play tennis. It was the blow upon, or near, the breastbone, the blow from a hard-struck tennis ball, which gave the princely physician a concern. "I fear me," the meddlesome apothecary had murmured, "I fear me that this blow might be the occasion of an imposthume, and that should your Royal Highness suffer at some future date from a severe cold, an inflammation on the lungs—" "Is nothing to be done?" inquired the prince, somewhat languid from opium and ipecac. "Am I so soon to leave 9 orphans?" There had been, after all, one other thing in which the king was powerless to constrain him. "Should we send for the chaplain?" But the physician in ordinary was not ready to send for the chaplain. "I should propose to bleed your Royal Highness once again," he said. The Prince of Wales, however, was not ready to be bled once again. "Then I should propose to purge your Royal Highness once again." But the prince absolutely refused to be purged once again. The physician in ordinary threw up his hands. "In that case," he said, and stopped. In that case, I must recommend. In that case, he said firmly, I indeed must insist upon your Royal Highness taking a long and immediate change of air." As was to be expected, the king managed to contain his grief. "A change of air? Where?" he demanded. "The Isle of Wight has been suggested, Your Majesty." "The Isle of what?" A map was brought, and the Isle of Wight pointed out to the king, who was pleased to give a grunt, interpreted as a gracious assent. However, His Royal Highness does not, it seems, desire to go to the Isle of Wight. The king had been playing backgammon with his mistress and already felt bored with this interfering subject. "Teufelsdreck! Then where he wants to go?" It was intimated that the prince had expressed a preference for either Hanover or France as the scene of his recuperation. The king gave a shout of rage and kicked the backgammon board across the room. Hanover? Never. Hanover in Hanover. In Hanover the air was sweeter, the water purer, the food better, the populace more loyal than in England, being understood. Hanover was reserved for the king himself to go to for changes of air, and as for France, He would intrigue with the French king. He would even intrigue with the pretender. It was pointed out to him that the pretender now lived in Italy and rather meanly on a papal pension, but the king would hear no arguments. Once let Frederick set foot upon the continent, why, what would prevent his going even to Italy? The force of gravity, maybe? He screamed with immense sarcasm. Nein, nein, he can go to the Isle of Wight or he can go to hell. Und if he doesn't want to go to hell, then he can go to America. At this, the royal mistress was unwise enough to allow a snort of laughter to escape her lips. The entire court waited breathlessly for the lightnings. But the king, having had his attention called to the fact of his having made a joke, abruptly decided to enjoy it. His hard-bitten little red face grew redder still, and the court, breathing inward sighs of relief, joined in the now royally permissible laughter. And on this merry gale, the prince's vessel was wafted out to sea. First aboard the Anna Maria was the royal and proprietarial governor. His cocked hat showing above the railing as he climbed the ladder, he was demanding, "Have you got me snuff with you? Have you got me Madeira? Have you brought me mail, me newsletters?" With a heave and a hoe, he clambered on deck, looked around. "Have you got any pretty wenches that have come to seek your fortunes in the new-found world? Have ye—" And here his face, which at just that moment focused on a slender and somewhat pale passenger, underwent an absolutely fascinating transformation. "Your Royal Highness," he bawled, and did not so much fall upon his knees as on his face. It was in this manner that Frederick, Prince of Wales, came to America. The king, it was reported, had near had an apoplexy when he heard the news, but he had, after all, given his permission. After a fashion, no doubt, but given it he had, and in the hearing of all the court. There was, then, nothing he could do about it. From the Court Circular and Gazette. His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, and their children, here followed a list, have, by reason of His Majesty's most gracious solicitude, engaged upon a visit to the American plantations, in order that His Royal Highness may recruit his health. No member of the royal family had ever before set upon the soil of the American plantations, the colonies, as it was now becoming fashionable to call them, and suddenly, in one stroke, here was 11 of them. They moved into the home of the royal and proprietarial governor, the R and PG moved into the house of the lieutenant governor, and the lieutenant governor moved into an inn. The governor's home was, for the Americas, palatial, but it was, after all, crowded with all of them there. It was damned crowded. "Let's build a little house," the prince suggested. My dearest? Shall we build a little house upon the river? Is that not a capital suggestion?" The princess thought it was a capital suggestion. All her life, after all, she had lived in houses built for others. The notion that she might now have a voice in designing one for her own use fell upon her ears like harpsichord music played by an orchestra of angels. The house was to be on the Delaware River, and not on the Thames? Bless you, it might have been on the Styx for all she cared. And in the meanwhile, for it was crowded in the governor's house, well, what about a visitation of the other colonies? And so it was arranged. The younger-most ones of the royal infants remained in Pennsylvania with their nurses. The eldest of the royal infants accompanied their royal parents. New Jersey and New York had heard with curiosity what they now beheld with enthusiasm. Connecticut had been cool, but the coolness was now warmed. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island and Providence plantations had, in fact, been skeptical about the whole thing. Who knew but that it was some sort of a flummery tale concocted down there in Pennsylvania? What would a prince be doing in America anyway? It was all obviously, or half obviously, a sort of granny's tale. Prince! There was no... And then, thunderation. Here he was. And would you just see what he was doing? Previous examples of British officialdom had merely sniffed at the coarse foodstuffs of the frontier, hastily ordered their cooks to prepare some French kickshaws, or at least a decent dish of mutton. Not Fred. The capacity of Frederick for the New England dinner, boiled or otherwise, was prodigious. Look at him, a-tucking into the baked beans. Didn't do a injustice to the hasty pudding either. How many bowls of chowder and how many quahogs did the prince eat down at the clambake? Up came the first selectman of the township of East Neantic, which was, so to speak, catering the affair. Sweating and smiling slightly, in East Neantic they smile slightly where others would beam, he called his order for more than haunch of venison for His Royal Highness, and not very long later, more roast beef for the Prince of Wales. In England, venison came from the king's deer, and the king was not inclined to share. In England, one had not known that bears could be roasted. In England, one had, in fact, never even seen a bear. The New Englanders looked at each other, looked at their prince, who gave them back a hearty grin, somewhat greasy about the chops, looked at each other again. Likes our victuals, do he? He do. Guess we ain't such barbarous critters after all, they said to each other. And they said, well, sir, I seen him. Even at this state, one may wonder, why had Fred such an appetite, such a zest for things? Well, for one thing, the provinces of the New World were, well, they were new. The hand of man had not yet had time to tame them, as in Europe, trim them into shape like yew hedges, turn their sparkling rivers into tame canals or drainage ditches. And in that pure air, under that clear sky, the despised son of what a later New England writer was to call a snuffy old drone from the German hive seemed to enter a new youth, almost without ever having, under the cold gaze and hot scorn, almost without ever having had a previous one. Here no one called him fool. Here no one called him scoundrel. And perhaps best of all, here no one called him poor Fred. After a while, the weather commencing to turn cold, Prince and Princess turned south, were reunited with the royal infants in Philadelphia, examined the progress on what people were already beginning to call the Prince's Palace. The Prince's Palace was not really quite ready yet. Not quite ready yet, eh? Well, there were colonies to the south of Pennsylvania, were there not? There certainly were. And, having heard of their sovereign son's reception by the colonies to the north, they were restlessly waiting to show him what they could do in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and even in far-off Georgia, hard upon the borders of the Spanish Dons. It was all very pleasant. It was all most pleasant. And so, as he was bound to do, sooner or later, the king heard about it. It is His Majesty's pleasure that the prince should now return. The prince did not return. Those listless days of playing cards before a smoky fireplace under a lowering London sky, listening to the slow babble of a second-hand and second-rate set of courtiers, were over. The prince's palace was finished now, but the prince had no intention of turning it into a copy of what he had left behind him. It was brought to his attention that what the colonies, menaced by French and Spanish and Indians, what the colonies needed was a well-regulated militia. Very well, then, he began to regulate, that is, to organize and reorganize and drill one. And, at the first occasion, another outbreak on the frontier, he led it into battle. There was no nonsense of bright, gaudy uniforms, such as his father so loved, preceded by loud-sounding brass and drums. In their native buckskin and hickory-dyed homespun, slinking through the wilderness as stealthily as Indians, the colonial troops met the enemy, and he was theirs. More shouts of rage in far-off London. Once again, the backgammon board was kicked across the room. "It is His Majesty's command that the prince shall now return forthwith." In tones practicedly smooth and outwardly respectful, the prince replied that his health did not, alas, permit him to return just yet. And, in fact, but let the story follow, turn by turn. The king was, of course, not without resources, and one of them was to commandeer the resources of the Prince of Wales. These were collected as soon as ever they fell due, and at once closed up in the privy purse. The king did not, to be sure, confiscate them. He merely neglected to forward them to the prince. "Let the vile backwoodsman pay Fred's bread and board," he said, or was said to have said, and so might as well have said. The Assembly of Pennsylvania voted the prince a subvention of £1,000 Pennsylvania. The Assembly of Maryland voted a similar sum. The Virginia House of Burgesses voted him 1,500. The race was on. From colony after colony, the money rolled in. It rolled in until word arrived that His Majesty has refused the royal assent to the subvention. By now, the colonial temper was hotting up. What was to be done? "The king be a-trying to take our prince away from us, be he? A-trying to starve him out, be he? Well, he bain't a-going to." The selectmen and town meeting of East Neantic voted the prince the best 3 lots in the township available, and promptly voted to rent them back at the best rent possible. They then voted to send the money forthwith as a further act. They also voted the prince's household 20 pecks of cornmeal, 2 barrels prime salt pork, a barrel of oysters, a barrel of clams, a hogshead of hominy, and 1 of samp. The list rolled on. "The king, he bain't able to veto the township of East Neantic. No, sir, not even he." It caught on. It caught right on. Within 2 months, the prince's storehouses not only bulged with victualry, peltry, and wampum, but he had become the largest landowner in any single colony one might care to name. There was lots of land. Could not the prince be said to have fled the realm, and hence to have abdicated, as was said of James II? The cabinet dubiously said that it rather thought not. The Privy Council respectfully said not, and even the law lords, with many a regretful harumph, said absolutely, absolutely not. Well then, what could the king do? Once again, the king was politely made to know that he could do nothing. Of course, he could die, and of course, he did. What happened next was compared to the flight of the wild geese, the flight of the earls, when the leaders of the Irish, almost en masse, took to their heels and, not waiting for the completion of yet another English reconquest, took refuge on the continent. Of course, it was not the same. It was because no one really knew how one stood in regard to the new king. "Frederick, by the grace of God." How odd it sounded. There'd never been a King Frederick before. Well, there had once never been a King George before either. And for that matter, no one knew how the king himself stood in regard to, well, anything. The Atlantic was white with sails. London Pool was left bare of any vessel capable of crossing the ocean, and Bristol the same. Every man with a place to lose, or hope of a place to gain, was posting o'er the white-waved seas. Was London the capital still? Well, Parliament sat in London, but only if the king summoned it to sit. The king was, after all, still very much the fountain of honor and of power. And each cabinet minister, each member of the Privy Council, each powerful marquis and viscount and earl, each of them had the thought that if he were the first to bring the new king the news, if the new king, panting for the crown, were to accompany him back to England. For bringing back an earlier exiled Prince of Wales, General Monk had been created Duke of Albemarle. Historians dispute who actually was the first to bring Fred the news. There was, after all, quite a crowd of them. They found him, and a hard journey of it they had had, too, in finding him. They found him sitting on a split-rail fence the other side of the Alleghenies, wearing a coonskin cap. Sitting on a what? The other side of where? Wearing a which? And buckskin breeches stained with grease and blood. They babbled out their news, their great news, and waited for the new king to cry for his horse. "I shan't budge," said the new king, and he spat a stream of something which they soon learned was tobacco juice. "I ain't a-gonna go," the king said. He rid himself of his chaw and called, not for his horse, for a dipper of rye whiskey, "to rinse out my mouth." Nothing was ever the same afterwards. Parliament was summoned to sit, and Parliament sat. A royal and ducal uncle opened it in the capacity of captain of the realm, but the Privy Council was held in Philadelphia. True, only a Parliament could, only a House of Commons, in fact, could vote the king supply, but secure in his colonial rents and revenues, the king did not need their supply. Ship money? Bless you, he had all the ships and all the money as ever he could need, right where he was. London? The king called London a cesspool full of snobs. He said that if London did not like it, London could kiss his royal arse. He did suggest that Parliament should make provision for American members. Parliament was dazed, but it did not feel itself to be as dazed as that. Parliament's term eventually expired. The king simply did not summon another one. What he did summon, by and by, was a sort of American Parliament called a Continental Congress, with the new Privy Council acting as a sort of House of Lords, a prominent member of which was the first selectman of East Niantic. The Prime Minister was a colonial, a native of the American Boston, who had moved to Philadelphia in his youth. His name was Benjamin Franklin. The detested Navigation Acts, so hostile to colonial manufacture and shipping, were in effect nullified. Before long, American shipping, so much closer after all to wood and sailcloth and resin and pitch, and just as close to iron, had begun to supplant British preeminence in the trade upon the seas. Who does not remember the great invasion of England planned by one Bonaparte? Who has not thrilled to the story of the sailing of the American Armada, which, under the command of John Paul Jones, swept the French from the seas in a twinkling? Who, then, could object to the fact that American troops now spat their tobacco juices in the streets of London? Franklin retired and was replaced by a Virginia planter by the name of Washington. "I detest your party, sir," was his common word. "Your faction, sir, I abhor." But he grew old, and for that matter, so did the king, and presently Washington stepped down and was replaced, of course, by another colonial. The king grew very old, but the king, though he did not die, less and less attended to the business of the state, leaving it more and more in the hands of his first minister. And this one was one who did by no means despise party or faction. Intrigue was middle name to him. The Americans had had little or no experience in such matters. The power slipped bit by bit from the hands of the old congressman before they even noticed it. And the prime minister, securing the Lord Presidency of the Privy Council as well, began that which some said he had aimed at all along, a dictatorship after the old Roman model. The old king no longer roamed the wilderness frontier, delighting in the hunt and in the rough but genial banter of the backwoodsman. He stayed in the by now truly palatial prince's house. The name had stuck and would never be changed, drinking rum cocktail and watching what were known as minstrel shows. One by one, the old champions of liberty slipped away, slipped across the seas, took refuge in an England which their forefathers, in the name of that same liberty, had long ago left behind them. The old king lived on and on and on. Though the prudence of retaining the American troops in England seemed clear to many, mostly in America, the costliness of doing so was also clear. The troops could hardly go and shoot game enough to feed themselves. England grunted at the first of the new tax acts. Stamped paper was to go up, was it? Well, they did not like it, but after all, it was the same both sides of the sea. One by one, the acts of Congress descended. Congress, as such, could not act for England, but the Privy Council could. It could act anywhere in the realm. An order in council, another order in council, and another. England, it was being said, now groaned beneath an American tyranny. And still, there was not enough money. The American troops needed new clothes. The troops were protecting England, weren't they? Well, then let the English pay for it. To be sure, some of this expense had to be shared by American taxpayers, too. One had to step delicately here. The Prime Minister-President cautiously considered. What source of revenue was there which would least vex the colonies? It did not take him long to find it. After all, in all the Americas, how many folks really drank tea? That had been the back-breaking straw. The British were long-suffering, slow to wrath. They were loyal. They endured the absence of their king. They had submitted to the loss of their parliament. They had accepted the presence of what were more or less foreign troops. They had muddled through the dismal diminution of trade. But raise the tax on their tea? On tea? The bells tolled in the churches, but not to summon the faithful to prayer. Fishwives and bishops, coal porters and Whig gentry, Thames watermen and bishops, cheesemongers and prentice boys, the beggars and the whores and the learned proctors of the doctors' commons all rose up as one. There was an East India vessel of the Honourable Company then in the Pool of London, laden with the newly taxed hyson, oolong, and pekoe. A mob calling itself the Sons of Liberty, said actually to be composed of the younger sons of peers, stormed the vessel and threw the tea-chests into the harbour, whence the well-sealed containers were promptly and clandestinely pulled out to be sold sub rosa and sub counter and sans tax by members of the Worshipful Company of Grocers. And, as though to express their opinions as to the source of the oppressive tax, the mob had dressed themselves as Indians. Could contempt and defiance go further? For almost the first time in English history, a parliament met without being summoned by the hand of a sovereign. The precedent, the so-called Convention Parliament, which had outlawed James II and confirmed the crown to William and Mary, the precedent was uncertain. But when a precedent is wanted by a people close to rebellion, any precedent will do. They did not meet in the old Houses of Parliament, long empty, though empty in a sense only, for the House of Commons had served for some years as a choir boys' school for Westminster Abbey, and the Commons itself was now used as a quartermaster's warehouse for the American soldiers. They met in the Guildhall, under the great statues of Gog and Magog. First, they repealed the old Act of Union. Then, under a slightly different style, they reenacted it. Then, they passed resolutions. This delay was almost fatal. The American troops marching down Leadenhall Street in their brave new red, white, and blue uniforms, symbols of oppression, and with their newly equipped bands playing rashly, oh so rashly, Yankee Doodle, were met by a withering crossfire from the newly reformed trained bands, hiding in the thickly clustering houses, and, abandoning their intended attack on the Guildhall, they were obliged to fall back, retreating across the Thames in the direction of Southwark. And so, now, all day, behind the barricades, the refugee American with the reddish-gray hair had toiled over the document. And now, at last, he looked up and he nodded. They marched into the great hall. They read the document aloud as the Liberty bells rang out, proclaiming liberty throughout the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof. And when the words were reached, resolved that these united kingdoms are, and of right ought to be, free and independent, then what a shout went up. Charles James Fox should be the first to sign, the American said. Charles James Fox scratched his bristly chin and shaggy chest, shook his unkempt head. No, sir, he declared. You have written it. The honor of signing it first belongs to you. Let that scoundrelly American Prime Minister President, let the tyrant who has driven you all from your homeland, let him see your name there for himself. The American nodded. With a wry smile, he said to his friend, Well, Pat, I now commit treason. Eh? His friend's comment was, If this be treason, let us make the most of it. The other, with a sound assent, picked up the proffered pen, and in a great round hand wrote, Thomas Jefferson. There, he said in grim contentment. Now Aaron Burr can read it without his spectacles. Afterward to O Brave Old World. Avram Davidson's fantasies of the 19th century are explorations of neglected incidents or alternative explanations of well-known events. O Brave Old World is a classic example of alternate history, now known, in academic circles, as counterfactual history. What if, Davidson asks, Frederick of Hanover didn't die young in 1751, and the British monarchy evolved along quite different lines? What if the seat of government were moved to North America? Many of those who write alternate history betray monarchist leanings. The portrait of the down-to-earth King Fred is quite sympathetic, but Davidson takes his politics several twists further. As England bears the brunt of an occupying army sent to combat Bonaparte in Europe, London becomes the seat of a revolution in which Thomas Jefferson raises the voice of liberty. Note also the cameo role of that scoundrelly American Prime Minister President Aaron Burr. Henry Wessells.
All right, what'd you think?
Well, that's a great story. And as with so many of Avram's, it contains everything of his entire work all in one story. I mean, the play of language, knowledge, and odd corners of history. Except this time he's doing it about America, but it's not an America that many of us would recognize, because he's inverted all of our expectations, and so American history suddenly gets seen through new eyes.
But with
I love the list of place names and the foods. The king, the prince's Fred's appetite when he got to America.
I mean, it's one small change in history. He changes everything, and it's hilarious.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
the insufficiently fatal tennis ball.
What is that? What else? I mean, I know from one of the things that I'd written down that just I thought was so beautiful was when Augusta gets to build her own house by the river, and fell upon her ears like a harpsichord music played by an orchestra of angels. I mean,
yeah. I hadn't remembered that Thomas Jefferson's friend, who's been with him through all, is Patrick Henry.
Yeah, I know.
And that that's I just these little things, and the scorn for Aaron Burr is a familiar. I think there are other places in Avram's writing where that arises. Maybe it's in some work he did with Michael Kurland. Aaron Burr is a scoundrel and an opportunist. And in fact, being from the New York area, we think very highly of our Aaron Burr, despite his problems with Hamilton, because he wrote the law setting, on the abolition of slavery in New York State, and he was a very progressive thinker, even if in Avram's story he's a scoundrel.
It's one of the things that Ethan and I spoke about last time, and it's a beautiful thing, but it's one of the challenges is if you don't know your history, you're going to see a name like Pat and have no idea what they're talking about. And so it's
right.
those subtle things.
Avram gives you some clues, but he does make you work. But it's really rewarding to think about, the idea of the ideas of America are not only, they could be transposed and inverted so that the ideas of liberty show up, in occupied Britain, and it's great fun.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I chose this, by the way, I thought it was timely given the election, not to get political, whatever your persuasion, I thought it's a perfect pre-election podcast to come out, and that's why I chose it.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, it resonates with Brexit and everything. The desire for independence from whatever imagined tyranny. It's good, and the zigs and zags of the narration are also really characteristic of Avram. That sometimes he'll come in and jump in to sort of say, but let's let the story tell itself, and then there's a line break, and it comes in goes on from a different perspective. He does that several times. He doesn't, he's not. He can get right into his story like a 19th century Dickensian narrator, and then other times he'll it's list poems and things that are not out of place in modernist literature.
Yeah. Well, I know, I think we've gone way beyond the time earlier.
Oh, okay. Wait, Sam, I had a question for you, because when we were talking, maybe it was back when we were in California, you said you visiting, you are often thinking about video adaptations of Avram's work. Do you think there's a way to make a costume drama of frontier America?
Oh my gosh, this one would be incredible. So it's good. I was about to actually end with that, which was the Netflix game that I like to play. So Thomas Jefferson, I have to go with Edward Norton.
Sure. Okay.
And then King George II. This one was, I love this. This would be the most expensive cast of all time, though.
Okay.
Ralph Fiennes.
Oh, okay.
Prince Frederick would have to be Christian Bale.
Okay.
And then George Washington would be Bradley Cooper, a quick cameo. He's expensive.
Okay.
Princess Augusta, Keira Knightley.
Well.
Yeah. And then the Aaron Burr cameo would have to go to Joaquin Phoenix.
Okay.
Wow.
And the costumes. I mean, everything from British court dress to frontier. It would be hilarious. I can see it.
It's interesting when we talk about Avram's stories, and I look at them and I think about which ones really could be a Netflix show or even my mom's work for that matter. I mean, there's some of Avram's that would be so incredible. I mean, he writes these short stories, but they're huge, they're vast, and it's incredible.
Yeah. Well, the other 19th century has a lot of those little miniature stories. The One Morning with Dorothy, Samuel, and William. It's got a lot going on in those 3 or 4 pages.
Well, this was so incredible. I hope you'll join us again, especially for the Philip K. Dick episode.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I can't thank you enough. And we will, let's be in touch. And obviously, when this pandemic's over, I can't wait to come visit you. Or
Well, I'm wondering whether I will be able this. If I don't get to California next year, it'll be the first time in almost 25 years I haven't been in February for work with the book fairs and things. I sure hope we can see our way to resuming life as we used to know it.
Yeah, well, my plan I've definitely decided once this is over, I'm going to take a road trip to all the libraries, to all the different archives.
Oh, that would be great. I'd love to spend a week in Texas. I at least I had the pleasure of seeing that the second piece of the Texas A&M archive in the house in San Rafael. Packing it up and getting it there. That was an important step for me personally and professionally to help secure a place for it and do the right thing by it. It was some real money for Grania for the stewardship of the archive, and it's there where it can be used.
That's great. Speaking of which, I've never said this, but if any, for the folks who do listen to this, if you have pictures of Avram or letters that you want to share, I would love to see them. But I think that's it. We can go on for hours here.
Yeah. All right. Until next time then, Seth.
Yeah, until next time.
Thank you.